Hello, everybody, and good afternoon from Flyleaf Books in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I want to welcome you to this third session of our Carolina Public Humanities Seminar on What Can Humans Learn from Animals? I'm Lloyd Kramer, and I am the Director of Carolina Public Humanities and also a Professor of History at UNC. And I want to thank my colleague Max Orr for his leadership at yesterday's first session of this seminar. And I also want to follow up on Max's comments by thanking again our many supporters who helped to make these discussions possible. And I particularly thank Carolina Meadows and the Merca Group at Morgan Stanley and the North Caroliniana Society, as well as the many individual donors who have continued to provide much appreciated support during this time of the pandemic. We deeply appreciate the great friends who have helped us reshape the work of Carolina Public Humanities throughout this extraordinary year. I want to remind you also something that Max mentioned yesterday, that there's going to be a special opportunity to support Carolina Public Humanities during the Give UNC Day on next Tuesday, March the 30th. And if we can receive 25 gifts on that day, gifts to our annual Fund for the Humanities, we're going to receive a generous matching gift of $25,000 from an anonymous donor. And this will be very helpful for CPH in part because, and I have to speak honestly about this past year, the pandemic has caused a major decline in our usual stream of CPH revenues. So this is an opportunity for us to build for the coming year. But I want to stress that our intellectual vitality is as robust as ever, and this vitality has relied, as always, on the great work of our CPH colleagues, such as Vicki Breeden, who manages to organize our CPH events, and Paul Bonici, who is brilliantly managing our technology and many other aspects of our programs. And Paul is with us again in the room today to manage today's technology. I want to remind you that we began this seminar yesterday with some insightful discussions of how human relationships with non-human animals have influenced human identities, movements for political rights, ideas about race and power, and diverse cultural themes in both literature and film. And our speakers, Sharon Holland and Al Duncan, explored these themes through numerous specific examples ranging from the struggles for African American rights in the 20th century and today, all the way back to the stories and fables in ancient Greece. And as Sharon and Al explained, human beings have long described their ideas, their aspirations, their cultural values, and their critiques of powerful people by using stories about the human relationships with animals. And as Max noted yesterday, many people have become even more aware this year of their deep connections with the animals in their lives. I think many people are spending more time with their animals than they have for many years. So today we're going to continue to discuss the evolving human views of animals, and we'll come back to some of the themes that emerged yesterday when we convene a concluding panel discussion with all of our speakers. But our first session this evening expands our analytical framework by focusing on what scientists have been learning about relationships among animals and within animal communities. So our third speaker in this seminar is Professor Karin Pfennig, who is a faculty member in UNC's Department of Biology. You'll find information about Professor Pfennig in the biographical summary you received with other materials for this seminar, but I want to note a few highlights of Karin's career. She completed her undergraduate studies at the University of California in San Diego, and then she went on to receive a PhD in biology at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And after holding several postdoc positions, she arrived at UNC to become an assistant professor in 2004. And she's risen through the ranks to her current position as professor of biology. Her work focuses on the role of animal behaviors in what she describes as the origins, maintenance, and distribution of biodiversity. And among other issues, she examines how the evolution of mate choices carries ecological and evolutionary consequences. And she seeks to understand how this behavior varies across time and in various natural contexts. Her work has been supported by numerous grants, and she is published widely in scientific journals. But she's also interested in how one can communicate scientific knowledge and insights to public audiences. And Karin has discussed her research in numerous magazines, podcasts, blogs, and other media. And her publications include a co-authored book entitled Evolution's Wedge: Competition and the Origins of Diversity, published at the University of California Press. And she recently won a very prestigious grand prize from the National Science Foundation for her idea to develop a project on public carbon capture and sequestration. This is a great honor. So we're very pleased to welcome Karin Pfennig to this seminar. And after her talk, we will have a Q&A session, which you'll be able to participate in through the Q&A function on your Zoom webinar screen. So I want to welcome Karin and for her talk, which is entitled Community Matters: Nature's Insights into the Value of Relations. Welcome, Karin, to the stage here at beautiful Flyleaf Books.
Thank you, Lloyd, for that introduction, and I want to thank everyone at Carolina Public Humanities for the invitation to be here, and also all that they have done to make this possible. It has been really fun, especially seeing the work of Professors Holland and Duncan last night. Hard acts to follow, and I'm excited about the conversation that we will all have to follow. And as Lloyd said, tonight I'm going to be talking about nature's insights into the value of relationships. And to do that, I'd like to begin by, oops, we jumped a little ahead there. Okay, there we go. I want to begin by trying to, by asking, what comes to mind when you think about the word evolution? And I know it's a little bit hard in the Zoom world, but I'd like to do a little bit of audience participation here. So I'd like for you to think about what word or phrases or ideas come to mind when you hear the word evolution, and throw those into the chat. So just type those into the chat function. And then Paul's going to read those out to me so that we hear what kinds of ideas and words do you associate with the word evolution. I'll give you a moment to do that. And I don't know if Lloyd or Paul want to shout things out if they have some words that come to mind.
I'll go first. Darwin.
Darwin, okay, so Darwin is often what comes to mind when people think about evolution.
Change.
Change, so change over time. What else do we tend to think about?
Selection.
Selection, so and often natural selection is something. Time, so change over time. There are other things that come to mind?
Gradual steps.
So gradual steps, so gradual change over time. Some other, yeah?
Creation myth.
The creation myth. Other things that might come to mind might be struggle, or survival of the fittest, perhaps. Competition. Any others that are coming out? Natural selection. So when we think about Darwin, we often think about natural selection.
Adaptation.
Adaptation. So yeah, all of those things are the words that tend to come to mind. And when we often think about evolution and illustrate it, we often illustrate it with pictures like what you see on this next slide. And they often describe sometimes negative interactions between species. So if you watch nature shows, it's often the case that something gets killed, usually something cute and cuddly and fuzzy, like in the case of this poor seal that's been eaten by a polar bear. We often see fighting between individuals as they might be fighting for resources or access to mates. We often depict adaptation, like we were talking about, as weaponry. Or we see competition in the context of large numbers of individuals crowded together, looking, and those individuals that are best able to compete for scarce resources are the ones that are able to survive. Now, our perspective on nature and ourselves is shaped by how we understand the natural world, and as often is the case with evolution, the person who is our sort of touchstone for developing ideas of how we think about evolution is Charles Darwin, who was the first to propose a viable mechanism for how evolution occurs. Now, Darwin did not invent the idea of evolution. In fact, his grandfather wrote about evolution. A lot of his contemporaries were thinking about evolution at the time. But what Darwin did was provide us with a mechanism for how evolution might actually occur. And that was through the process of natural selection. And so I've illustrated, I just want to bring us all up to speed for how we think, for how we know that natural selection works. And so if you look at the top left box on your screen, what you see is that just a recognition that populations often consist of variation, that individuals differ from one another in what they look like or how they behave. And what you can see is we've got some green beetles and we've got some orange beetles, and they're all on this sort of brown background. And what is going to happen is that, well, okay, these darker colored beetles, they tend to stand out more and are more obvious to predators, and so they're more likely to be eaten. Now, because they get eaten, they don't survive to reproduce, but the survivors that do make it reproduce and produce offspring. And because more orange beetles survive, they're the ones who leave behind more offspring, so that in our next generation, we see that change that you all mentioned over time, that the frequency of green beetles, the percent of green beetles in the population has declined, and the percent of orange beetles has increased. And so over many generations or iterations of this kind of selective process, we can get to a population that consists of all orange beetles. So that's how we get our change over time, or our adaptation. And basically what this comes down to is we get survival of the fittest, that phrase we often associate with evolution and natural selection, where evolution's winners are the ones who leave behind more copies of themselves. Now, this notion that survival of the fittest is what determines evolution, who wins in evolution, has not only affected how we think about explaining variation in the natural world, but it also has infused our thinking about how we interact with each other and in society. So this has led to sort of caricaturing and in some ways, I hate to use the word, well, I won't say bastardizing the way that Darwin thinks about things, but through social Darwinism and thinking, sort of caricaturing Darwin's ideas, we've applied this notion of survival of the fittest and natural selection to everything from economic policy to describing who we think are the winners and losers in our own society, as we illustrate here at the top figure. And even though these notions of social Darwinism have been debunked, they still influence the way we often think about who are the winners in our society. And as we can see on the bottom cartoon, that a lot of what we think about in life is competition or running as fast as possible in order to just survive and beat the others. So the sort of almost extreme version of this way of thinking sort of was described by Richard Dawkins in this landmark book in the late 1970s entitled The Selfish Gene. And what Dawkins argued is that genes are the fundamental unit of evolution acting to propagate copies of themselves. And individuals, people like us, we are nothing but vehicles that hold these selfish actors. And so we are just vehicles for the propagation of these selfish genes. Now, I'm not going to debunk the notion of selfishness or competition today, and I want to acknowledge that competition competition among selfish actors is an important component of evolution that can explain much of the diversity that we see in our world, and that's part of what my research has been about. But today, the premise of my talk is to highlight that there are other aspects of how the natural world works that provides us with counterpoints to these examples of selfishness and competition. And in particular, that the natural world reveals that community, diversity, and positive interactions among individuals, among species, are keys to success. And so it's not necessarily that survival of the fittest is survival of the most selfish necessarily, but instead that survival of the fittest might represent survival of the most social or the most genial. So what I'll be talking about today then is to step back and talk a little bit about some evidence for selfishness thinking or selfish gene thinking, and then describe what we see as the fate of selfish genes. And then I want to turn from that to talk about community at three different levels. So the community of the genome and the value of interactions among genes. And then look upward in terms of organization to how species can facilitate each other to survive and to thrive. And then talk about variety and diversity within the context of community and evidence that we see that diversity within communities provide stronger and more productive communities. And then I'll end by posing a question and looking at the implications of this sort of more community thinking for understanding ourselves and the problems we face. And I hope that that will be a launching pad for some of the conversation that we will have this evening. So to turn to this idea about selfishness and selfish gene thinking and looking at the evidence for this, one of the places we see evidence for extreme selfishness and selfish genes is during the process of meiosis. So each of us has 2 copies of our chromosomes, of each of our chromosomes in our most of our somatic cells. We have 1 copy from dad and 1 copy from mom. Now, in order to reduce the number of those copies to our gametes, so that our gametes, our eggs and our sperm, that they only have half as many of those chromosomes, we go through this there's this process of meiosis that basically reduces the number of chromosomes. So if we have our, looking at the top, we have the diploid parent. We have a big S allele at a given gene and a little s allele, so a different version of that gene on the other chromosome. What's going to happen is that those chromosomes get duplicated and then they get shuffled and separated. And so down at the bottom, by the time you're producing eggs and sperm, each copy is going into those eggs, okay? And in general, what we expect from meiosis is that they should separate independently, so that what should happen is that we should get 50% of the big S allele represented in the next generation, or potentially in the next generation, and 50% of the little S allele. So our eggs and our sperm should be divided half and half between those 2 chromosomes. What's surprising, though, is that what we often see is that we can get really large skews in terms of what can happen. So in some cases, we can get 95% of the eggs or sperm are carrying the big S allele, and only 5% are carrying the little s allele, okay? And so this is really surprising, and the question is, well, what is happening? And it turns out that this deviation from what we would expect under what we call a fair meiosis is that it's due to the activity of selfish genes that are called segregation distorters. So these segregation distorters basically disrupt meiosis in a way that causes some of those chromosomes to be overrepresented, or more copies of them in the gametes than what you would expect. Now, just for full disclosure, this is completely outside of my area, and so I do not know how segregation distortion works. These are molecular genetic mechanisms that are way over my head. So I'm going to explain to you a kind of segregation, so I can't answer questions about the details of how these work. But I'm going to just take you through one of the kinds of segregation distortion that I kind of grasp a little bit. And basically it's a pair of genes that act selfishly. And so the way that these segregation distorter pairs work is that you have one gene that produces a poison and a neighboring gene that produces an antidote to that poison. And so these are genes that are in the sperm or the egg, and what the poison gene does is it releases poison outside of the cell that kills all of the neighboring sperm and eggs. The antidote, though, rescues that cell from being poisoned. Any other cell that does not have both the poison and the antidote is killed. Okay, so basically what's happening is that that pair of poison and antidote is ensuring that they have a very high likelihood of being represented in the next generation because all the competition is killed. Okay, so there aren't other sperm or eggs to make up the babies in the next generation. So these kinds of segregation distorters can be incredibly successful if we think about this from the perspective of evolution, that if left unchecked, what they do is they rapidly spread through the population. So this is looking at the frequency of a segregation disorder in an experimental population of fruit flies over time. So on the y-axis is the frequency, it's in terms of a proportion. And on the x-axis there, the horizontal is time. And so the population starts off with about 20% of the flies have the segregation distorter, copies of the segregation distorter alleles in them. But within about 250 days or so, the population goes to where almost 90% of the population has copies of these segregation distorters, okay? So from an evolutionary perspective, this is a really big win, okay? So selfishness is clearly being rewarded in this case. Now the problem, though, is that if you are, I'm anthropomorphizing here, if you are a gene on another part, in one of those sperm or eggs that has been killed, you're an evolutionary loser, okay? You have lost in the sense that you're dead. You are not going to be able to propagate copies of yourself in the next generation. And so what that means is that there's a really strong selection now into other parts of the genome, other genes, for the suppression of this selfishness. Okay, and so what happens over time then is that selection on all the other genes in the genome favors the evolution of mechanisms that suppress the activity of these segregation distorters and restore a fair segregation, so put things back to the way they should be. Now there are a couple of different ways that this can happen. One is through what we call dominance. So if you have a gene, the big S and the little s, if the little s is the segregation distorter, what you can get is the evolution of another allele at that locus that basically shuts down the allele at that other copy. But you can also get it through a process of epistasis, where other genes in the genome act to suppress the activity of the segregation distorter. And so basically what happens is it's the interaction of this community within the genome that suppresses selfishness. And so what happens over time is that the selfishness tends to decline. So going back to these fruit flies, this population of fruit flies, remember what we saw is at the beginning that segregation distorter reaches a really high frequency, but if we let the population run, if we look at how it goes further over time, what we see is that the selfish segregation distorters start to be lost in the population because we start to get the evolution of modifiers that suppress that selfishness. Okay, so it's the interaction between these different genes that now start to basically shut down that selfishness. So this is kind of an exciting way of thinking about how interactions basically have a way of winning in evolution that is beyond the idea of selfishness. So extreme selfishness, yes, is rewarded in the short term, but interactions that suppress selfishness can be rewarded in the long term, okay? Now, what I want to move on to, though, is looking beyond the idea of just selfishness. Epistasis is important not just in the context of suppressing segregation disorders, but any kind of interaction between genes actually has the potential to produce really interesting and novel traits. So we often think about a gene for a particular trait, so a gene for blue eyes or a gene for curly hair. But it turns out that many traits are not simply specified by a single gene. They actually, what happens depends on what is going on at other parts of the genome, what other genes are doing. So for example, my daughter and I both might have the exact same allele for curly hair, but her hair might be straight simply because she's got other genetic variation in her genome that interacts with that gene to prevent it from turning into wacky curls. So we can see an example of this, a really simple example of this in coat color in certain kinds of mice. So if we look at the top, we've got two mice parents that are chocolate brown in color. And whether they're chocolate brown or the light tan color is dependent on whether or not they have a big B or a little b at this B gene. Okay, the B gene is what controls color. Now what's interesting though is that sometimes when you produce these, when you cross these chocolate mice, you actually get white offspring. So where does that come from? Well, it turns out that whether or not you even get color or not, whether it's chocolate or tan, depends on what's going on at another gene, the C locus, that determines whether or not coloration even occurs in the mice. So as a result of this kind of interaction between genes, now we're getting novel phenotypes that are entirely new and not what we would necessarily expect based on looking at a single gene and its activity alone in the parents. Now, the study of epistasis, and again, this is outside of my field, but it's a really exciting area in biology because it's giving us new insights into how you go from a genome to a phenotype in an individual. But they're actually really hard to study because it's very difficult sometimes to identify these interactions, and they're often much more complicated than just between two genes. You can have interactions between a single gene and many other genes in the genome. You can have three-way and higher order interactions. So one of the places where epistasis has actually been really interesting to study is in a different kind of interaction, and that's an interaction between species where they mate with one another, or the process of hybridization. And one of the things that happens in these mating interactions of hybridization is that they really reveal epistatic interactions. And the reason for this is that we define different species because they are often very genetically distinct. And because they're genetically distinct, when we bring when we mate them and produce hybrids, we often get we often reveal all of these genetic interactions in ways that we would not have been able to see within each species. Now last night, Professor Duncan talked about hybrids as being considered monsters, and I think Professor Holland also made reference to some of the ways we have thought about hybrids in the past. And historically, evolutionary biologists have thought about hybrids as evolutionary dead ends. The worst thing you could possibly do is to hybridize. But it turns out we're actually undergoing a renaissance in biology and thinking about the role of mating interactions between species and hybridization as a place where there is now evolutionary potential. And the reason is for these kinds of epistatic interactions. So what I'm showing here on this slide is two crow species from Europe, the carrion crow and the hooded crow. And what you can see is that the carrion crow is all black, the hooded crow has this black head and then the black wings. And when you mate these two, because of these epistatic interactions, you get a whole diversity of phenotypes among the hybrid offspring that you would not have expected entirely based upon just what you see in the phenotypes of the parents by themselves. Now, why is that important? Okay, we get neat colors, but depending upon what kinds of traits you're looking at, these can be important in terms of biological and ecological opportunity. So one of the things that happens with hybrids is that it allows them to be able to move into, by having new traits, they can move in and explore new habitats that neither of the parents would have been able to live in. So I'm illustrating this with this cartoon here where I have a fish in the top. It's got the sort of disc plate-shaped fish that's adapted to the white background, and the sort of bullet-shaped fish that's adapted to the gray background. And when they hybridize, because of these genetic interactions, they produce something entirely new. And that novelty now enables it to move into a completely new habitat that's different, entirely different from the parents. Now, we have evidence of this from a lot of different systems, and one of the places that we see this in a really extraordinary way are in cichlid fish. So cichlids are really something that's really fun in the pet trade. And one of the things that's remarkable about cichlids is they're an incredibly diverse group. They're beautifully colored, and they have remarkable features in terms of their jaws that allow them to feed on all sorts of really different, interesting kinds of foods. So they eat on algae, they eat on snails. There are even some cichlids that are specialized for eating on the scales of other fish. So they're really quite remarkable in what they are able to do. And one of the things they do is hybridize. And so these data that I'm showing you are looking at pure species, or what we call pure species, or parent species, on the ends of each of these boxes. And in the middle of these boxes is the hybrid. And this is looking at how these parents and the hybrids perform on novel food resources. So the top two across the horizontal are feeding on different types of algae, and the bottom are feeding on little shrimpy type food. And the red that I've circled there is showing you that in the top right and the bottom left panels is showing you that the hybrids are doing better at feeding on this novel resource than either of the parents. And that's because they have traits that are completely different from what the parents have. So they're able to do better in this new environment. And so what we're seeing is that this kind of interaction, both at the level of genes, but also in terms of just this mating interaction that produces these hybrids, has produced something new that can go and explore novel ecological environments. And we see this kind of pattern replicated throughout the natural world. I know we're talking about animals today, but I do have plants in here, so forgive me for generalizing beyond the theme. But this is an example from sunflowers, where we have sunflowers, the two parents again are on the right, the hybrid is in the middle. We have two species of sunflowers that are adapted to different habitats, and the hybrid is able to move into an entirely new habitat of dunes that neither of the parents can survive in. So, so these interactions create new diversity and the ability to move into new places. So hybrids are not a dead end. They actually have a lot of evolutionary potential. Now, one of the things I'm sort of focusing on, though, is hybrids in themselves occupying new environments or novel habitats. But one of the things that hybridization can do, and so now I'm going to start moving away from interactions between genes and now move to interactions between species, is that hybridization can be a bridge to help each of the parent species adapt to new habitats. And so I'm illustrating this here. So going back to that cartoon with the fish, so we have our plate fish at the top that's adapted to the white background. And we have, again, the bullet-shaped fish that's adapted to the gray background. And they're producing these hybrids. Now, what the hybrids can do is, instead of going off and occupying a new habitat, they might just mate with the parent. So in this case, I'm showing them mating with the plate species in the white. And because they're carrying genetic variation from the other parent that's adapted to the gray, they can actually transfer that variation. And as a result of that, now that plate species adapted to the white background can move into the gray habitat. So basically, the hybridization, that interaction, enables the species adapted to the white background to now be able to move into this gray background. So this is one of the things that I study in my research, and so I want to spend a little bit of time unpacking this kind of example for you. And I'm going to do that with this example of spadefoot toads, which are the animals that I work on. I focus my research on two species of what are called spadefoot toads. There's a plain spadefoot, which is shown at top, and it's called the plain spadefoot because it occurs throughout the Great Plains of the western United States. So it's occupying habitats all the way from Canada and all through that green down into that gray area. Now, I also work with the Mexican spadefoot. It is a desert-adapted species. It occurs from Mexico all the way up into the deserts of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, and it also occurs in this gray area. So the gray area is where both species come together, and they actually do hybridize, so they mate with one another. Now, one of the things that makes spadefoots interesting is that if you know about frogs and toads, desert environments are really bad for amphibians because amphibians, they require moisture and water, and a desert is not a good place for that kind of habitat. And so spadefoots spend most of their lives actually hibernating underground away from this desert environment, and they only come up above ground after summer rainstorms. Now, these summer rainstorms also flood low-lying areas and create ephemeral pools, so little ponds that may be smaller than your living room, sometimes maybe only as big as a dining room table. And these ponds will often go dry in a matter of just a couple of weeks. So the tadpoles have to develop really, really fast. So the tadpoles are just, they're just little marbles with tails swimming around, and they have to turn into baby toads before these ponds go dry. And the reason for that is shown in that picture, that little inset. So that's a picture of a little tadpole. He's still got his tail, but he's sprouted all 4 of his legs. So he's made the transition to becoming a baby toad, and he's moving onto land. But all of those things in the background there that look like pebbles, those are actually baby tadpoles, so baby spadefoots, that are drying out and dying. Okay, so every year we can get thousands of tadpoles that die because they don't make that transition to land, and so they just dry out. So it's important for them to develop really fast, and usually spadefoots do that. But the problem is that the plain spadefoot, because they come from more of a grassland habitat, they are slow developers. Okay, so what we generally expect going to thinking about hybrids as an evolutionary dead end, the sort of dogma is, well, plain spadefoots females should always mate with plain spadefoot males. But instead what we find is that that's not always the case. Instead, plain spadefoot females will often mate with males of a different species, the Mexican spadefoot. And it turns out the reason for that is that the hybrid tadpoles, the tadpoles that are produced by a plains female mating with a Mexican spadefoot male, is that the hybrids develop faster and are more likely to get out of the ponds. And so that's important because, like I said, if they don't develop fast enough, those tadpoles will die. So the problem, though, is that when those tadpoles grow up as hybrids, hybridization, I'm sort of painting a rosy picture of hybridization. There are good reasons to think that hybridization is not always a good thing. And in the case of the spadefoots, there are epistatic interactions that are bad epistatic interactions, and the adults are less fertile. So they don't produce as many offspring as the parent species types. But for a plains female, if she is breeding in a pond that is highly ephemeral, so one that's going to really dry up fast, in that kind of environment, it's actually better to hybridize because by doing so, she would, so let me back up. So in a deep pond where there's time for the tadpoles to develop, it would be better for her to mate with her own species. Oops, I think we missed something there, but okay. But in an ephemeral pond, it is better for her to mate with a male of the other species because the hybrids would be more likely to get out. And it's better to have some offspring than to have none at all, even if they are lower fertility. So what we see then is that what females will do is an individual female will prefer to mate with a male of her own species when the water is deep, and there's enough time for her tadpoles to get out. But what the females will do is actually mate with the males of the other species when it's better to have these hybrid offspring. So these mating interactions have been really important for females to be able to produce offspring that are more likely to survive and thrive in these challenging environments. So when we put all of this together, what we are seeing in the evidence, and this is a project that's actually ongoing right now, is that we believe that the presence of the Mexican spadefoot, this desert-adapted species, and the mating with those males of those species is what's enabling the plain spadefoot to actually move into this desert habitat. So work in the lab has shown that the center of origin, so where the plain spadefoot originated, is probably in the Kansas, Nebraska area. And that species has then expanded and migrated its range northward, but also southward into the desert habitat. And we think that the only way they actually transition into the desert habitat is because of these mating interactions with Multiplicata. And we have a number of pieces of evidence for that, and I'm happy to answer some of that in the question and answer period. But one of the pieces of evidence we have is that even if we go into some of the desert habitats where we find plain spadefoots by themselves, we only find them by themselves in what we call these playa lakes. These are large, humongous, basically almost lake-sized shallow ponds that can last for months and long enough for their tadpoles to develop. But we only find plain spadefoots in these smaller, highly ephemeral ponds that dry up in a matter of weeks. They're only there in the presence of the Mexican spadefoot. So it's this other species, this already desert-adapted species, that is facilitating the ability of the plain spadefoot to move into that habitat. Now, spadefoots aren't the only ones who have benefited from this kind of gene exchange to explore and move into new habitats. So humans have a history of hybridization ourselves. So Eurasians are about 2% Neanderthal. Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians are 2 to 5% Denisovan. So I'm a complex mix of 2.5% Neanderthal and a little over 3% Denisovan. So I'm not just a hybrid, I'm a complex hybrid. So I took it personally when Professor Duncan referred to them as monsters. I guess I am one, and I'll proudly proclaim it. And many of us are, frankly. And one of the things that's been really exciting is to try and understand the role of these mating interactions and hybridization in our evolutionary history. And one of the exciting results that has come out is that by Huerta Sanchez and colleagues, where they were looking at the people of the Tibetan Plateau. And the Tibetan Plateau is, of course, a remarkable environment for humans to live in because it has very low oxygen, very high altitude. And the people there have a unique variant of a gene called EPAS1 that is involved in the regulation of blood oxygen levels. And what's interesting about this gene that what Huerta Sanchez discovered is that that variant is derived from an archaic human species, Denisovans. So the idea is very much similar to the spadefoots, that hybridization allowed our species, Homo sapiens, hybridization with Denisovans allowed us to acquire genetic variation through these mating interactions that allowed us to move into a novel habitat and explore this new area. Okay, so I've been focusing on mating interactions and hybridization, but what I want to highlight is this notion of facilitation. So the ability of one species to enable another species to adapt or explore novel ecological situations is not limited to cases of hybridization. And these kinds of facilitative interactions are found throughout the natural world. Everything from what we see on a daily basis of pollinators and flowers, ants that are acquiring nectar from aphids and then providing protection in response. All of these kinds of interactions are what we call mutualisms. And mutualisms are found throughout the natural world, and they occur at all levels of biological organization. And as I said, we see them every day, and we experience them every moment. So basically, one of the most important mutualisms that we directly experience is that of our gut microbiome. Okay, so the microbiome has become sort of a really exciting avenue for research for its role that it plays in keeping us healthy and how it impacts disease. And it's a critical part of digestion, and that microbiome within us are mutualists that enable us to basically survive and thrive in our world. So mutualisms are an important component that often don't get the kind of attention that we might and that we should place on them, because they've been key to our evolutionary history and the evolutionary history of most species on this planet. Now, facilitation and interactions between species are not necessarily just one-on-one types of interactions. And what I want to highlight now in just a moment are examples where we have what are called ecosystem engineers, where a single species has the ability to facilitate and promote the success of entire communities and entire ecosystems. And the poster child for ecosystem engineers are beavers. So many of you are probably familiar with beavers. We, of course, have them here in North Carolina. So this is a picture of a beaver with a beaver dam. So what they do is they build these dams that block water flow. And it's good for the beavers. It provides them with homes. But it's also potentially good for the other species that are impacted by the way that beavers change and alter their habitat. And these are images from a recent study by Law and colleagues, and this is looking at the impacts of beaver during wetland restoration. And so these are pictures from one of their study sites. They actually had 3 replicate sites I'm going to show you in just a moment. But the left shows you what the habitat looked like before a beaver was introduced. And on the right, we see what happened after beavers were introduced into that habitat. And you can see just by looking at this that the change is very profound to what that system looked like. And the question is, well, is that a change for the better or not? Well, one way we can characterize how healthy a community is by looking at the number of species that are present in that community. And so what they did, that Law and colleagues did, was to follow these habitats for 10 years after beaver introduction. So what you see on the left in each of these plots, A, B, and C, are showing you 3 different sites where beavers were introduced. And on the right is how many species were there in 10 to 12 years after beaver introduction compared to the first year or 2 after beavers were introduced into the habitat. And the bottom line is that what we see is that species richness consistently increased over time in all of these communities. So what beavers were basically doing was facilitating the ability of new species to come in and succeed in these habitats through their modifications and actions in the system. Now again, this kind of activity is not limited to beavers. We also see this in plant systems. This is a Spartina grass. It's a kind of wetland grass. It's important in wetland functioning. And one of the things that it can do is actually promote diversity and more diverse communities because of its presence. And so this is work I want to highlight from my colleague John Bruno, who's also in the Department of Biology here at UNC. And so he studied the effects of this kind of grass in rocky tidal zones on the coast of New England. And so this is one of the study sites where Spartina is present. So Spartina is the grass that's on the far right, closest to the water. And what you can see behind it are all these perennials and annual species, a much more diverse species than what you get in the absence of Spartina. So if you don't have Spartina present, you get a habitat that looks like this. Okay, a much more species poor environment than when that grass is present. Now, the question is, okay, well, maybe that habitat is just not conducive to having any sort of greenery there. But what John did was to hypothesize that, well, maybe what the Spartina is doing is protecting all these more delicate plants from tidal action and the moving of these rocks and boulders that get washed around by the tide. And so what he did was to actually physically stabilize the substrate. And what he found is that when that substrate is stabilized and prevented from rolling around from the tide, then all these annuals and perennial seedlings could then sprout and grow. So basically what's happening is that when that Spartina grass is there, it's buffering all these other species from wave action and the movement of these rocks, and as a result is promoting all these other species that are coming in as a consequences. So this one species is facilitating not just diversity in terms of these plant species, but now all the other animal species that would follow along. So basically what we're seeing in all of this is that species are facilitating each other. They can promote the success of many. But the question is, okay, if we think about competition and survival of the fittest and selfishness, maybe what happens in those communities is that you get a lot of species, but maybe they all suffer as a result. And so the question is, what happens in those communities when you bring all these together? And now I'm going to end by talking about some plant experiments, because plants are really easy to do experiments in, and so this is where some of the best work is showing that. And it's because we can do experiments like this. This is work by David Tillman, and this is just a beautiful experiment in the Midwest, where those are plots of land that the researchers are going in and manipulating how many species are in each of those squares. And so basically they go in and they pull out by hand and make sure that those squares stay at the number of species that are intended. And you can see that there are very big differences in each of those squares in what those communities look like as a result. And so just looking at that for a moment, you might want to ask yourself, well, what would we expect from competition theory? Would we expect that something with more species looks a little more yellow, or something with fewer species looks a little more yellow? So what would our expectations be by looking at that plot? Well, it turns out that contrary to what we might expect under competition, it turns out the more species, the better. So if we look at plant species richness, which is what's on the horizontal line there, versus total plant cover, and we can also measure this with just total biomass, so how much green stuff there is in the plot, what we see is that it actually increases as you get more species. So more species means that the individuals are doing great. Well, and so, one of the questions might be, well, maybe this is really rich soil and everybody's doing okay because there's not really competition. What happens when you add stress? Well, when you add drought to the situation, you still get the same answer. So even under stressful conditions, it turns out that those communities actually rebounded from stress more readily than that when they had higher species richness than when they had lower species richness. So in other words, within these communities, even in the face of stress, you had facilitation among these species occurring that enabled them to respond and be resilient to that stress. And we can see this again. I wanted to highlight some work by my colleague Charles Mitchell, again in the Department of Biology, doing a similar kind of experiment, but this time he was looking at pathogen spread among the plants. So these are diseases of plants. And what he found is that as species richness increases, that actually reduces the amount of parasites and pathogens that are found in those communities. The incidences of disease actually declined as diversity increased. So what we're seeing here then is that even within diverse communities, that doesn't necessarily bode ill for the individuals that are in there, that facilitation can make those communities strong and resilient and productive. So just in terms of my takeaways from this evening, I want to highlight that yes, selfishness and competition can drive aspects of evolution. But, and I think the big but that we often ignore when we think about evolution and evolutionary interactions, is that positive interactions and facilitation of others is also important in evolution. And that interactions and diversity can create novelty and strength and resilience even in the face of change and challenges. And I think that's an important thing for us to start infusing into our cultural understanding as well. But I also think that the natural world teaches us to value the natural world. We're seeing the importance of diversity and the ability of species to facilitate each other, and that facilitation becomes important and critical when we start thinking about the fact that we're actually starting to lose a lot of this diversity. And as was mentioned last night, we are facing a global extinction crisis, and so are losing diversity and complexity. And so in particular, if we just look at some of the groups that are at risk, what we can see are, we can look at extinction rates. So we have data on the species that we are losing. And what I'm showing here is the percent of species that have already gone extinct over time. So this is going back to the 1500s. When we can look at patterns of animals that have gone extinct. So this is focusing on vertebrates, so our closest relatives in the animal world. And that dotted line down at the bottom called background, that's what we call background extinction. That's the extinction rate we expect based upon the fossil record. And so what you see is that all of those lines are really way above background extinction rates, and they're accelerating. And they've especially been accelerating since the industrial age. Now, these are animals that have already gone extinct, but we have a lot of species that are still at risk of extinction. This is a graphic highlighting the percent of animals and plants and parts of the natural world that are currently threatened with extinction. So these are animals that are extinct. This is a paper from Diaz and colleagues from last year, so this is really recent. And what you can see is that of the 70,000 vertebrate species, a quarter of all mammal species are at risk of extinction. Nearly half of all amphibians are. So we have some major threats to biodiversity, as you can see from these scales. And if we look at invertebrates, we have over 1 million described species. Things like crustaceans, coral reefs, which are ecosystem engineers upon which many of our food resources rely, are at risk of extinction. So this is a very real threat that we're facing. And we're not just facing loss of particular species, but we're losing a particular kind of species. So the species that are most vulnerable and are most likely to go extinct are those that are sort of special to their particular region. They tend to have what we call narrow ranges, so they're only found in small areas. And so things like lemurs that are found only in Madagascar, or this parrot, cockatoo species that's found only in the Philippines, or Venus flytraps that are only found here in the Carolinas. These are the kinds of species that we are losing that play special roles in our local communities. And instead, what these are being replaced by are species with much wider ranging species. They're what we call cosmopolitan in the sense that they're kind of found all over. And they are species that have a tendency to be able to succeed in more urban and suburban environments. So what this means is that our communities are also not just losing numbers of species and diversity that way, but they're losing particular kinds of species, and the communities we have are becoming increasingly homogeneous as a result in terms of the types, not just the numbers of species. So I think that all of this brings us then to the last point that I want to make that I hope will be a foundation for some conversation that I'm looking forward to this evening, is the question we could ask ourselves is, what kind of species do we choose to be? And in thinking about the answer to that question, I want to actually end with a quote from Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene. And what Dawkins basically argued, even though he argued that we are vehicles that are selfish replicators, we do have the benefit that we can have conversation and process and think about how we want to act. And he, at the end there, I'll let you read the quote, but at the end he says, "We alone on Earth," and we might dispute that. I wouldn't actually undercut what other animals are capable of doing, but we certainly are the ones who get together in forums such as this to have conversations. And we can rebel against the tyranny of our selfish replicators. And so with that, I want to thank you, and I will be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. That was terrific and very wide-ranging, Karin. And I just want to begin with one question. We've got a couple of questions coming in, and I want to invite others to ask questions. But the overall takeaway, could you explain a little more that how your work revises that classic kind of Darwinian image of survival of the fittest and in fact turns it on its head and says that what we learn from nature is the value of diversity and collaboration rather than survival of one species through competition?
Right. Well, so I guess what I'm trying to get at is that that these positive interactions can be the way in which you have survival of the fittest. So, you know, I mean, the way that mutualisms and altruism are often framed, especially in selfish gene thinking, is that, well, mutualisms are just mutual selfishness, right? That you're still acting for yourself. And in a sense, it's a little bit like, you know, what they tell you on the airplane, right? Put your oxygen mask on first so that you can take care of the other people there in the plane. So there is that, you know, so you can interpret this as not necessarily entirely undercutting what we're already arguing about. But I think that the important, I guess what I'm trying to affect in terms of talking about these positive interactions is that it's not necessarily the dog-eat-dog world out there that we often characterize it. And as we take these lessons and bring them in and think about how we interact with each other, how we interact with other species, you know, we could frame it in terms of, well, it's in our best interest to take care of our mutualists, to take care of the other people around us. And so, you know, at that level, it's not necessarily an entirely revolutionary way of thinking about it. So I guess maybe it's a glass half empty, glass half full type of thing. At the same time, though, there are, and we don't fully understand this, I think, the degree to which, and this is where epistasis does come into play, or other types of species interactions, is that the outcome is not necessarily the sum of the parts. And in some of the selfish thinking, you might expect that, well, if you take one away or take the other away, they should be able to do fine on their own. And that's not the case, right? We couldn't do without our gut microbiome anymore. We can't do without the mitochondria in our cells that are the remnants of mutualists. So we become more integrated. So there is part of that interaction and complexity in the history of life that I think we're still trying to understand and tease apart.
So one other element of this, just in terms of the philosophical question, in the 19th century, people began to argue we can learn from nature about what we should be doing as human beings, and it was often used as an argument for capitalism or for competition. You're still saying humans can learn from nature. So in that sense, you're replicating a traditional conception, but you're trying to reframe it in a new way. Is that right?
I mean, I think part of the problem with learning from nature is we engage in a little bit of a selective filter. We kind of learn what we want to learn, right? Yeah. Like we can justify our demons, or we can justify our better angels, right? And so I guess what I'm saying is that rather than justify the demons, this would be a good time to look to nature to justify a better way of approaching things. And so and if we're going to engage in a selective filtering of what, and I guess that's what I'm trying to get at, is that yes, selfishness and competition is there, but let's not only look at that, let's look at the variety of ways that positive interactions shape the natural world, and in some ways far more profoundly, well, I should be careful, I shouldn't say that, potentially more profoundly than these negative interactions, and as a result, maybe we should start taking that into our filter out too.
Well, and based on your conceptions of the vitality of hybridization or hybridity, we could imagine that a very multicultural, diverse society, community, is going to flourish more in the long run than one that is not that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that-
And, you know, conversations about hybridness, purity, you know, those go back to having their grounding in racism and racist ideas. And
Yeah.
so, you know, it's not founded in terms of what we see in the natural world.
This is actually a very strong argument against racist ideologies, I might
Oh,
say.
yeah, totally.
Especially
since
well,
those of
let me
us
go
in
to a few
Europe
of the other
are
questions. We
hybrids.
can come back to these issues of hybridity and the interaction of different species. Jerry Everhart has a question. Can you comment on the possible effects of climate change on the speed of evolution in a given species, or how is climate change affecting the processes you've described?
Yeah, so that's actually a really great question, and one that is an area of active interest. So it turns out that evolution happens much more rapidly than we expected. That's kind of one of the old paradigm of gradualism is important, but we realize that it can happen depending upon the species. It can happen in a matter of years. It's observable over a study, and so evolution and adaptation is a way that populations could respond to climate change. The problem is that the question is whether or not environmental change happens fast enough in a way that, and so the key is whether or not there's enough variation. So remember, going back to that how natural selection works, there has to be variation on which selection can act. If you don't have variation, you don't even have selection. So if all those beetles were all green, there would be no evolution of orange until some orange variants came in, okay? And so in a climate change scenario where we're especially changing the habitat so rapidly, some species don't have the variation to be able to respond to those new climate change scenarios. Complicating that is that we are, because of our activities in terms of habitat loss, degradation in terms of hunting, overfishing, invasive species like cats and rats and the things we have introduced, they are suppressing populations and making populations smaller and more fragmented, which means that those populations consist of less variation. They become homogenized, which also reduces their ability to respond to climate change. So it's a delicate balance, and we don't know what the answer is. And so that's an area where people are really concerned about what is going to be the future and are looking at that.
Do you think that climate change helps to account for that spike, that huge spike in the extinction of species?
Probably not. I mean, there is certainly some, and obviously in terms of the major changes to the oceans in aquatic species with corals and coral bleaching events, that is profound. A lot of the early extinction events were probably due to overexploitation, overhunting. Again, these invasive species, you know, cats are really, really bad and other predators that are human associated at killing lots of endemic species. So a lot of it has to do with that as well. Yeah.
Like urbanization probably.
Oh
has a
yeah,
huge
just
impact.
I mean, yeah.
So this is a question from our distinguished colleague Max Orr, who thanks you for your great work as always. He says, this is a more technical question perhaps, could you explain the difference or the relationship between epistasis and epigenetics? Do they describe different phenomenon?
They do. So epistasis is the interaction of alleles at different genes. Epigenetics are modifications to the expression of genes. So, and depending upon how you use epigenetics, it can be basically any sort of non-genetic inheritance. So, like nutrition that's passed on in an egg. But for many people who are geneticists, they restrict epigenetics to basically additions to the DNA strand. There's sometimes called what we call methyl marks, or things. So basically additional chemical compounds that are added or removed from DNA that allows that DNA to be expressed or not. So they basically turn genes on and off. So they are different mechanisms, yeah.
Okay, thank you. This is a question from a participant named Jane, who says, Are you familiar with a book called Humankind by Roger Bregman, which makes the case for the importance and prevalence of cooperation and altruism in human society?
No, but I will have to look that up. That sounds
But-
great.
So in effect, I guess the question embedded in this is that this is part of what you're drawing from your study is the importance and prevalence of cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
And you would extend it to human beings as well as to...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, one of the things, humans are fundamentally a social species, and one of the things that likely made us successful is our ability to engage in, basically be a social group. We're a highly social species. And so, cooperation is a fundamental part of that. And the question is, how can we, do that further, and how do we apply that, I think, to also the way we interact with the natural world as well, in terms of thinking, again, we can put this in a selfish context to our own benefit, not just to the benefit of others.
So the question I think that always arises when we start to think about the relation between the biological world and human cultural life is that classic nurture versus nature, or how much are our lives determined by these kind of genetic and natural relations, and how much by cultural and educational factors that go far beyond that? Do you have a view of that? I know that's sort of like the ultimate question, the nurture-nature question, but it seems that you do see some really important biological foundations for what we do in our human societies.
Yeah, and I guess the way I would answer it is it really is both, and that it's not possible to isolate one or the other, but it's the interaction of the two that are so important. And one of the areas, and this is my spouse, David Pfennig, is also in the Department of Biology, and he studies this field called phenotypic plasticity. And basically what happens is that you can have two individuals that have identical genomes, but you put them in different environments, and as a result, they produce entirely different phenotypes, so different behaviors, different traits, because of the way in which the environment interacts with those genes. And so, okay, some of you might say, well, that's all nature, but not necessarily, because if you took another genetic clone that was also identical and split that between those two environments, they might actually react much more similarly to one another, because that genome might be less likely to respond to the environment. So it really isn't as simple as nature or nurture, that some traits are more sensitive to environmental inputs than others. Some genotypes, so some genetic variants, are more sensitive to environmental inputs than others. And this goes back to Max's question about epigenetics, that some of the way in which inheritance and these epigenetics interact with the genome are what make them more or less sensitive to the environment, right? So I really am not sure that dichotomy is actually a useful one for us to think about anymore, that there are going to be cases where we might have a very difficult time teasing those two apart, because it literally is not possible to tease it apart, if that makes sense.
So, and the other implication of this is that the critique of hybridity, whether it be cultural or biological or any other kind of hybridity, by those who want purity, you're suggesting that hybridity is actually not a monster, but can be a very productive and even essential step forward for a community.
That's
and
right.
for the survival of that community.
That's right. And so, I don't want to, there are cases where hybridity can be a bad thing in the natural world, but not, we have underestimated its potential in terms of how it can contribute to just entirely novel ways of doing things. And so if we, thinking about that in terms of culture, just think about the different ways that we can mix things up to get something so much more powerful, so much more interesting and new. And so, it's definitely, to me, looking on that upside, And we see this in the natural world. So going back to the cichlids, that this is an incredibly diverse group that is occupying does all these crazy new things. And we think part of it may be because of how much hybridization they've done in their evolutionary history.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we've discovered in the last 10 years is how common plant people have known about hybridity and its value for a long time. Animal people are just now catching on and discovering that it's much more common than we thought, and it's much more powerful in terms of being an evolutionary force than we thought.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. I remember how the Nazis used to think America was a hopeless society because it had all of these races and communities mixed in. And then the opposite argument, of course, has been that's the great strength of the United States. So, I mean, there's a biological component to all this. We're going to come to the end here. We're going to take a break of about 15 minutes, and then we're going to reconvene for a panel. But I want to thank Karin Pfennig for a terrific overview of all kinds of complex issues. And thank you so much for bringing your perspectives to the table.
Thank you. It's so fun.
Thank you. We believe the humanities need the hybridity of the sciences, and the sciences need the hybridity of the humanities.
I absolutely think the sciences need the humanities.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so I say to all our audience, we're going to take a short break, and we will reconvene with all of our speakers in about 15 minutes.